Well, welcome back to Group Theology. This time we're going to be taking a look at the idea of that this God that we looked at in the previous section, who is three in one, who is marvelous and majestic and wonderful and so curious in so many ways that even in the mystery, there's this invitation to continue to explore that this God is not silent in any way, shape, or form. That this God is a God who speaks. And that in and of itself is an amazing thing, that it's amazing to know that the God that we're so curious about is a God who communicates to us. And so, what we really want to look at is this idea of God speaking to us. And there's really two primary ways he does that. There's this idea of kind of general revelation, which is the idea that God communicates through general things to all people at all time. Namely, this is through creation. This is where we're going to spend much of our time in this session. And then he also speaks through what's called special revelation, which would be things like the scriptures, that he spoke to specific people in specific times about specific things, and those things were captured and written down so that we could also hear what God had to say. Special revelation would be things like not only scripture, but Jesus himself is a special revelation. It's God speaking to us, that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, that all that can be known and seen about him can be known and seen because Jesus communicates that to us. And so we're going to take a look at that in the next session, but really where we want to focus this time around is in that general revelation, how God speaks through creation. And so what we see pretty immediately is that God has created all things. That scripture is going to start out by saying that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It's going to continue by saying that all things were made through him. This is John chapter 1, verses 3. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made. Colossians 1 is going to say he made everything both in heaven and on earth, the things that are visible and the things that are invisible. That Romans 4:17 is going to say that God calls things into existence that did not exist, that everything there is, every piece of existence, understanding, knowledge, perspective, anything that we can observe in any possible way is here only because God spoke it to be here. That we read in that Genesis account that God spoke and it was, that he spoke these things into existence. He communicated very literally through what he spoke out. Now, he could have just thought it. He's powerful enough to just think and have it happen, but he chose to speak, I believe, to communicate to us that he wants to communicate to us. And so we see who he is and what he's like through what he has spoken into existence. We see this idea in Romans chapter 1 where Paul's going to be unpacking that, hey, we can know everything that can be known about God has been shown to us. His invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so we are without excuse. It's basically saying that all there is to know about God, what there is to know about God that draws us to him in a way that leaves us without any excuse for worshiping him, it can be seen through what he has created. And so there's all sorts of implications and things that kind of flow out of that. We can see going back into that idea of he calls into existence things that do not exist. We can see that God, he speaks, and what he speaks comes true. That God speaks things. Whatever his words say will come true. We see this elsewhere in Scripture. He says, every word that comes from my mouth will not return to me void. It will accomplish everything that I set out for it to accomplish. That's a big theological truth that we can glean from creation. That God is a God who speaks, and what he says comes true, even in things that did not previously exist. That it's not like God can speak and make things out of things that already exist, like he's got a stockpile of resources and so he can piece things together. That's how we do things. but that he is in another world altogether, another level altogether, in that he can speak something that is not, and because he spoke it, it is. And that's absolutely amazing. And we see this in the physical world around us, both kind of the meta, the overarching, the big, the stars, the planets, the solar system, the universe, how large and like those things are huge and expansive, and he made those, our planet, mountains, trees, redwoods that you can drive a vehicle through, that he has created all of these massive things, Grand Canyon, and anything that you can look at and go, oh my gosh, the ocean, it's huge. God created that, both in the kind of meta way and also in a very micro way. All the microorganisms, the things that we need help to be able to see because they're so small, God created those, the physical aspects, the things that we need a microscope to get down into and see at a nuclear level or whatever it might be. God created those physical things, the cells and the electrons and the proteins. I'm no scientist. I don't pretend to understand all of how that works, but how it works and that it works and what it is that works is all created by God and him speaking these things into existence. And it's not just the physical, the visible things, but it's the invisible things. It's things like relationships. It's things like families. It's a desire. Like desires are God given. Now they can become disordered desires, and we'll talk about that in another episode of what happens when our desires become disordered. But the fact that we have desires, that's an invisible thing that God has created, that has spoken to existence. That's not something to run from or be ashamed of. That God-given, rightful, ordered desires are a good thing that God has created. This desire for eternity, the idea of eternity, freedom, time, these are all invisible things that God has spoken into existence and that we have much to be grateful to him for. We see even in creation, as we talked about in the previous section, the picture of the Trinity happening. We see the Father as kind of the primary initiating agent in creation. We see the Son, that all things are made through him and for him. We get that from the Gospel of John, chapter 1. And we see in the beginning the Spirit hovering over the waters, enacting the initiation of the Father and the words of the Son. This is where that idea of the Spirit being breath, that the Son speaks the thoughts of the Father, the will and the intent of the Father, the Son speaks, and the breath that is spoken out is the Spirit enacting all that has been spoken. And what we can start to glean from all of this is a really important theological thing for us personally as group leaders, for our groups, is to remember and to understand what we see in creation is that there is a very clear creator-creation distinction. That those two things are very distinct. They're not the same at all. There are some worldviews and some ways of thinking that kind of lump them together, that God's kind of inside of our time, or we're able to be elevated to his area, or that there's some kind of meshing of the two. But we see very clearly that there is a delineation between a God who can speak nothing, or can speak into nothing and create something, and a creation that has been spoken into existence. That those are very different things. And so we see this kind of balance in that in creation we see that God is transcendent. He is above all. He is over all. He is bigger than all. He is mighty and he's not just a bigger, better version of us. He's other altogether. He's completely other than us, that we can't even begin to compare to be like what he is as we examine this. But it's not just that he's transcendent, it's also that he's immanent. That we see in what he created and how he created it and how through Scripture he interacts with what he created, that he's not just other than and unknowable or unapproachable, but that he's also immanent. He's close, he's personable. He's inescapable. The one way one of these books that I was reading put it is that there's kind of an unbiblical view of transcendent that would say that God is unknowable. That's not really what the Bible teaches in terms of transcendent. What it does teach is that he is unapproachable, that we can't get close to him outside of him getting close to us, that we cannot approach him in any way, shape, or form. That's transcendent. But in the same way, He's immanent. That the unbiblical side of that would be to say his immanence means he's indistinguishable from us. That's not true. He's very distinguishable. The biblical view would be to say that in his immanence, he's inescapable. That he is unapproachable but inescapable at the same time. That he is other than but also close to. And we see this so clearly in creation, the creation narrative, and in all of his interactions with his creation since he created it. That God is immanent and transcendent. He's big and unapproachable in that sense of not being able to equal or rival, but he's also close and inescapable from us. It's not that we're indistinguishable, but he's inescapable. I think what else we see in creation is pretty clearly God created much more than he maybe needed to create. That the universe is what would be called a gratuitous universe, that he went over and above. Like there's a certain worldview, a certain way of thinking that says we just need the basic building blocks to survive. Like he could have created this world that all we needed to do was take one little like white pill or one little white thing or whatever it might be, a little dab of something, and that would sustain us in all of our nutrients and needs. But God didn't do it that way. He created it in such a way that there's an overabundance of good and pleasure and things that are tasty and beautiful and smell good and sound good. And not just one of each of those, but many of those. Like you think about it, there could have just been one type of bird and one type of fish and one type of land animal, but instead, all combined, you get 8.7 million different types of species. That God created a gratuitous universe because his creation is not out of need or necessity, but his creation is out of the overflow of who he is, and he is gracious. He is good. And so what his creation speaks to us, what he speaks to us through his creation, is that he is good, and he is enjoyable, and he is creative, and he is lovely, and he is worth pursuing, and he is wonderful, and he is majestic. And so he shows that to us through the variety and the overabundance of what he created, when what was necessary is far, 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 far less than what is actually here. And so we see how beautiful that is. Of creation is not the fact that the world came into existence, but that it didn't need to. One of the core components of this creation story of God speaking things into existence is that it didn't need to be that way, but he did it anyways because he's good and he's gracious and he's overabundant in what he gives. And I think that's an absolutely beautiful thing. You know, it ties the whole idea of grace, not into just salvation, but into everything that God does, that God does things graciously. He pours out graciously. Another author named Christopher Watkin says it this way: it is through grace that the Christian is born again, but it is also through grace that the universe is born in the first place. That everything that has happened from creation to salvation, and even now in our sanctification and our ongoing walk with Jesus, is God graciously giving and pouring out. He graciously, overabundantly, you read through the book of Ephesians, and so many times in those opening chapters, it's by the riches of his grace, the purpose of his grace, his overabundant grace. It keeps referring to how big and large and how much this never-ending grace that's poured out on us. And we see this clearly in how God spoke the world into existence. One of the other things we see in creation is that what God speaks not only is effective in what it creates, it's not just practical in that it accomplishes something, but it's also valuable in that it establishes value. And so we see God speaking, and he will speak something into existence, and then he'll say, and it was good. And it was good. And that's not just a realization. It's not like he created it and like stepped back and was like, oh yeah, look at what I did. That was pretty good. It is a declaration of, I call this good. And so what we can glean from that, what's important to us as group leaders and for our groups, is that it is God who determines what is good. It's not our realization or our understanding or our perspective. It's not goodness is in the eye of the beholder. It's goodness is in the spoken word of the Creator. that if God calls it good, it's good, and if he calls it bad, it's bad. That John Corson would say it this way: sin is not bad because it's forbidden. Sin is forbidden because it's bad. Nothing is good or wrong until God calls it what it is. And he's not saying, oh, well, it's bad because I just don't want you to do it. He's saying, I don't want you to do it because it's bad for you. And I declare that. I'm the one that determines that. And so again, we see the creator-creation distinction. God's the one who not only makes things exist, but he assigns value and goodness to them. He's the one that determines that. That's important for us. And then finally, I think one other thing we can look at doctrinally, theologically, from this idea of God speaking creation is that God speaks for 6 days. He speaks things into existence. He creates everything that is invisible and visible. And it's important to note that on the 7th day, God rested. That even in his silence, God still communicates something to us beautiful and powerful that we need to realize and remember and install and instill in our own lives. And that's that God didn't rest out of tiredness. He didn't rest so that he could recuperate his energy so that he could go on doing more. That's often how we look at rest. God rested not out of tiredness or out of preparation for more work. God rested out of enjoyment of what had already been done. And that is one of the main points of the idea of Sabbath, which is born out of this idea of God resting, is that we would rest not out of, oh, I want to strive for more, so I need to prepare to get more energy back, but we would strive out of enjoyment of what God has already done, what God has already spoken, what God has already enacted, that we would rest and enjoy what he has created. And so that's kind of a brief look at this idea of general revelation through what God has created, how he has spoken to us, and what we can begin to learn from him. In the next video, we're going to take a look at what are some more of those implications for us as group leaders and in leading our groups that we can begin to apply.